Hello everyone, this is Chara and welcome to part 2 of the Splatoon's only tier list for 5.3. You can catch part 1 in the description where we covered every sub-weapon, and we're just going to jump right into it with special weapons. Alright, so first up is Splashdown. Now, Splashdown's been the bottom of the list for a while now. It's been pretty much seen as the weakest special in the game for over a year, and the reason is because at a good level of play, it's just very predictable and easy to cancel. Because it just has a set height, duration, pattern, everything, it basically just makes you a giant target. So, it's really the simplest part about it. But even if you want to go into the actual landing, it's basically just a solid painting zone opportunity that has the bonus option of being able to break ballers, bombs, and bubble blower. However, Booyah Bomb can do that exact same thing without being the vulnerable death option. The other option is jumping in with the Splashdown, but because you can see when you have your special on the top of the screen, opponents can always know when you're Splashdown jumping, and a lot of times at top level are going to be aware of it. So even then, it's a very easy to avoid option. It still has some uses. Sometimes it can be used to paint, some situations you won't die, obviously. And just, of course, sometimes you'll be able to get a safer landing. But its value compared to other specials is incredibly minimal, which is why it sits at the bottom. Next up is Auto Bomb Rush. Auto Bomb Rush is really solid in one situation, which is when they have to try to push back in. It's pretty solid at just walling out, putting a bit of explosion hitboxes out there, and being something that you have to watch out for. You just have to be careful not to drop into all the auto bombs. It can also be used to reveal a sharking opponent, which can be useful in some specific situations if there's one person left alive, since you can cover a lot of area very fast, and the weapon it's on that's normally used Carbon Roller can kill very quickly. Overall, while it has a solid use, similar to the Splashdown use being outclassed by Booyah Bomb, other bomb rushes just tend to do that same lockout feature way better and do way more. The other thing to note about Auto Bomb Rush is it actually doesn't paint that much, and it's very easy to lure a lot of the auto bombs to blow up in the same location since they follow people, meaning a lot of times these bombs are just going to be painting over each other. Alright, next up in B tier we get to a lot more solid of specials. First up is Curling Launcher. Curling Launcher is pretty underrated just because it isn't on a lot of things, but it actually paints a ridiculous amount. On smaller zones where the curling bomb can actually bounce between, it paints a ludicrous amount because the explosion not only paints well, but also the original trail. Something that some people don't know is curling bombs are the same in Curling Rush as they were pre-patch, meaning the explosion radiuses and trails are both larger. On some maps like Humpback Zones and Skipper Pavilion Zones, it's incredibly useful how much these curlings can paint by bouncing around, and the ability to throw them farther faster by charging it is actually very useful. What makes it more situational is that, again, other bomb rushes are useful in more situations, and on other maps where it's harder to get the curling bombs to bounce or where they can roll off, it could be weaker. Walling out it can also be useful in some situations, but again, it depends on the curling bombs being able to bounce a lot of the time. Still a very underrated special. I could definitely even see it being a tier higher, but it's just hard to tell because the only weapons that it's on is Silver Aerospray and Sorella Tent. Maybe if more tent players decide to use it on more zones maps, it could potentially see more use. But as of now, this is where I'm putting it. Next up is Burst Bomb Launcher. Burst Bomb Launcher is pretty different from all of the other bomb launchers that we're covering, which is basically that it's going to be quick, rapid damage explosions. It can still be used to paint, but it's very different. In this case, it's kind of a committal bursting down option that can be applied at a longer range with a slower fire rate, with the main downside just being the vulnerability of it. It can be used to paint as well, but arguably not as well as other bombs, and put a bit less pressure since they're not as lethal. But it does have more uses in combat and fighting, especially with Soda Slosher. Though, if you put this thing on a weapon that isn't Soda, it definitely has more dependency on the main weapon being able to combo with it. Slosher is just arguably the best weapon to combo with Burst Bomb in the entire game. So in the sense of being paired with Soda Slosher, it definitely could be a tier higher. But if you look at the special as a whole, it can be a bit inconsistent, and sometimes the damage of Burst Bombs can be a little bit low, as well as, again, being a bit less pressure than other bomb rushes, which is what leads me to put it in B tier. Last up is Inkjet. Inkjet is ultimately going to struggle more in zones because of compared to other modes, because it's a lot about pressure and killing, but it's very situational. In zones, the meta right now is a lot of survivability and stalling, so being able to wait out Inkjet is a huge problem for it, and basically means Inkjet users have to be really good at getting a pick and have to be really careful. Armor is useful to survive, you could play passive in paint zone with Bomb Rush, Bubble Blower can keep you alive by playing in the bubbles, etc. It makes it a little bit more difficult for Inkjet to thrive. The other bad part is the actual recall itself. Part of why stalling out Inkjet is really good is because when you have to recall and then swim into the fight, it's basically a 4v3 assuming your other teammates are all alive. Which means for a little bit, people can push up and take advantage of their numbers advantage, which at top level can be pretty damaging. So it's very situational. Inkjet of course can still get some clutch picks and can sometimes be very useful, but other times when teams are prepared for it, it's really difficult to get value from it, especially depending on the weapon comp they have. Next up is A tier. Stingray is pretty solid for tick damage long distance. It is somewhat technically vulnerable, but most of the time you'll be using Stingray in a safe position, and good rays are threatening enough to where you'll have to commit some kind of special for it. The main positive for Stingray is being able to force better specials like missile or armor early. Say if you have a Ray and armor team and the other team is just an armor team, raying to force their armor so they burn their armor early, and then you can use armor and take the team fight when they won't have theirs to counter, and if they don't use armor, you can potentially get a pick with the Ray. That's the kind of situation where Ray is good in. Obviously, a bit of long-range tick damage is always semi-useful, and that could be nice for pushes. However, it's still just the fact of being able to force a better special isn't really a better trait than just having that special. But the main thing that puts Stingray lower is definitely its dependency on map geometry, as while some maps like Walleye, Mall, and Port, Ray are very strong on, other maps it's a lot easier to avoid, such as Humpback. So it's very dependent on that. Obviously, Ray is better in TC and Rainmaker when it has an objective to target, or even Clam Blitz because of the Power Clam, but in zones it doesn't really have as clear a target, so it's very situational. C-Jet, yes, is very good right now, but part of the reason is C-Jet can get so many Rays that it can burn an armor and then get Ray before that team can get another armor. So it's more of C-Jet's ability to get a lot of Rays, along with being able to defend itself, burst bomb, and a bunch of other things we'll get to when we talk about it. So it's more the Ray output, rather than Ray itself carrying it. Next up is Booyah Bomb. Booyah Bomb is a very interesting special. It's a panic button that can sometimes save you, has a bit of HP, and can be thrown. What some people need to know about Booyah is Booyah isn't actually as useful for the painting, it's more for displacement. The reason is because when Booyah paints, similar to Ink Strike in Splatoon 1, it paints all the way on the inside and then spread out to the outside, meaning if you shoot in the center of the Booyah Bomb, you can actually start to paint over it, which means it could be difficult to cap the zone. Booyah is mostly used to be able to displace areas. Sometimes it can be used for painting zone, but it will be combined with the push into zone or other specials, and it's mostly to put the supports that can put paint onto the zone out of it. It's also very good at hard countering bomb rushes, since it eats the bombs in that bomb rush, which can be very useful. As a panic button, it's definitely worse than Baller because its HP has been reduced over time, but the main thing is Baller can move and reposition while it's being shot at, whereas Booyah you're kind of stuck. So that's where it is right now. If bomb rushes get stronger, I could see Booyah being a bit better, but as of right now, this is where it stands. Next up is Ultra Stamp. Ultra Stamp is a bit of an interesting special. It can be used in a lot of different ways. The hammer itself being able to block shots means it could be useful for survivability and stalling in areas similar to Baller. The rush mode allows you to get potential picks. It can also eat bombs, and then the throw mode gives you a long distance kill option, albeit an unreliable one, but one that can definitely still put some pressure that you have to watch out for when a hammer is popped. Ultimately, hammer has a lot of really good utility, and there's a lot of different ways I can use it, which is what puts it here. It's not always going to be a killing special, but it can be. Sometimes it can be good against specific specials, and then other times specific weapons, such as slower weapons like Explosher, or things with Brella shields like Brella and Tenebrella, as well as Splash Walls, even though it's not as notable. So Hammer overall has a lot of utility. That means it will always generally have a use in whatever comp it plays against, and there's a lot of different options you have with the special, so it can never really be that low. Lastly is Baller. Baller has been definitely a lot worse over time, but I think people just don't really realize what the special is used for. It's not really about the explosion and getting a kill out of it. It's the ability to keep yourself alive and stall an area. If there's a baller under a drop, you can't drop until that baller is destroyed or blown up. If you're going into a plat and you like pushing someone and then they react and they commit on you, you can baller and get out of there even if they commit their specials, which means you're protecting and preserving your life, which in a meta about being patient and staying alive is very important. So baller is very useful in that regard. The main weakness is that outside of that, it doesn't really do anything. It's purely a survivability and stalling tool, and it's really up to your team to be able to play around it. However, some other global specials can generally get a bit more value than a simple panic button. Yes, you can push in with baller on the front lines, but baller can also get popped very easy from bombs, which we've already established are pretty common, and a lot of the other specials such as the bomb launchers and bubble blower, ultra stamp can all deal with baller pretty well in terms of being able to break it. So it's still fairly situational. Still a very strong special. Next up, the S tiers. Rain bomb rushes are both really similar. Splat and suction rush are about the same, with splat bomb rush being a bit faster, though suction rush being a bit delayed. Both are basically equal and do about the same thing. Rain, while not painting as much, is way less committal because you just throw it and then it exists. Bomb rushes, you have to stay and actively throw bombs. All of these do about the same thing. They stall or put pressure onto a zone or an area. You can put it on like a charger where a team wants to push from to apply tick damage or remove armor. You can put it in a zone to contest paint or do damage to people on the zone. The differences is really just splat and suction paints a bit more and lasts a bit longer but is more committal, while rain is less committal. I see them all as about even and very solid special options. There's not really much downside to them. The main weakness of bomb rushes is just their vulnerability, while rain doesn't really have much but can sometimes get less value just depending on how people play around it. Overall, really good specials. Next up is bubble blower. Bubble blower is really useful for just having 3 giant explosions basically. Bubbles have to be respected in the same way baller does. The difference is if you could have multiple bubbles, you don't have to be inside the bubbles, and you can control bubbles very easily, and of course, they last a lot longer than a baller does before its explosion. The other positive thing is a lot of bubble weapons such as Kensa Jr., Forge Pro, and Squeezer can pop the bubbles very fast using their bombs, which gives them basically an instant explosion that can even kill through armor since the bomb explodes before the 2 bubble explosions. Ultimately, it gives it a lot of strong utility, a potential kill option that your only real option is to keep your distance from, or a nice stalling objective. I'd say this mainly just gets counterplayed by things trying to shred it, such as Booyah Bomb, Ultra Stamp, 10 missiles if you're sitting in bubbles, and ultimately just getting rushed through them. But bubbles are very good for stalling and a lot of times can keep a lot of respect and control a lot of area. They're probably the best stalling special on this entire list just because of how long they can last. The only other weakness they have is just their dependency on special power-up. Next up is Missile. Missile is a global special where you get basically a few things. You get slight displacement and you get echolocation. You obviously get to see where people are and in a competitive setting can call them out to your teammates and then you can missile them. If they're clumped up, they're going to have to move a lot or be dealt tick damage. The main weakness of missiles is more when they're just split up more. If people don't have to be as clumped together, then missiles aren't going to force them to move as much. It also depends on the comps and the map. Some maps people have to play more together and some comps will be slower. So ultimately, while it's a nice global special, it's still very dependent on what it's playing against. Overall, it's still very useful and is a very good way to pressure backline. Its main positive compared to Booyah Bomb is that you can use it on multiple targets and from infinite range, whereas Booyah, while having long, is a set range and only can be thrown in one area. And last up, you know it, it's Ink Armor. Ink Armor is really just has the ability to be comboed with any of these specials. It doesn't really get countered by any of these specials besides maybe Bomb Rush, but even then it depends on the map control that you have. Ultimately, Armor is always just a special that can combine with other specials for a lot of usefulness, and the ability to have a little bit of extra HP is just the most useful thing when pushing back in. It gives you an opportunity to take space and has to be respected, since it gives every one of your members a direct advantage in combat. Armor has been a staple in the game for a while and has always been a strong special, but as of now, it is even more so the best and most common one. Definitely not overpowered, but most often the most common special that you will see, and just again works very well with anything and creates opportunities. And that's the specials list. Be sure to let me know what you think, and we'll be covering main weapons next. We have a lot to cover.